This story is told from the perspective of a 25-year-old woman that had one of the most shocking neighbour experiences that I have probably ever heard. I had been living next door to my neighbour for the past 4 years. He was in his 30s, kind of an odd guy. Really, he just kept to himself. He never really made much or any effort to interact or converse with myself or anyone on the street. During the week of this incident, I noticed that he was even more distant than he usually was. As he pulled up into his drive, he would almost bolt into his house and shut the door. On the rare occasions that we would actually make eye contact as he went in and out of his house, he would always ask me in a rather paranoid manner if everything was okay. He would simply repeat this a few times and then either drive off in his car or go inside his house and slam the door. These were all small things that maybe I was reading too much into. It would not be long, however, until very strange, seemingly inexplicable things would begin to happen. I awoke one night to the sound of screaming, coming from next door's direction. These were no normal screams, not that you could call screams normal, but they were horrifying, blood-curdling screams. After about 1 minute, the screaming stopped and became nothing more than silence. I thought that I might have just been hearing things, but the next day I spoke to my friend Claire that lived in the house in front of mine. She too had heard the screams. They had awoken her as well. My neighbour was out at work and had left his trash out in front of his house. I did not pay any attention to it at all at first, but then I could see Claire looking rather shocked. Then Claire said, "What is that?" I looked at the trash cans and I could see something that looked out of place on top of it. I walked over and began examining it. It was somebody's hair. Lots of blonde hair, just sat on top of his trash can. Me and Claire both looked at each other in shock. Not knowing what to do, I told Claire that I would keep an eye out for anything odd. A few days went past, and sometimes at night, I believed that I could hear the faint noises of screams coming from close by. It was so faint, however, that I could not tell if I was simply imagining it. Sometimes, when you think there is something happening, you can start seeing signs that are not even there. I was scared that could have been what I was doing. On one day, I was doing some work in my garden, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I began hearing what sounded like tapping sounds, like somebody tapping on glass. At first I ignored it, but as it kept happening, I began walking around looking for where the noise was coming from. To my shock, the noise appeared to be coming from my neighbour's basement window. When I looked at the window, the noise of tapping on glass suddenly stopped. I went back to doing work in my garden, and when I glanced back at the window, at first, I couldn't quite believe my eyes. Someone had written on the glass. They had steamed the glass up and written something with their fingers. It read something that I will never forget. 91GH 9M. I looked at it in sheer confusion. What could that mean, I thought. I thought about it for a while, and when I looked back, it was gone. Somebody had wiped it off the window. Later that night, I kept thinking about what had happened and what was going on. I kept thinking about the digits, 91GH 9M. I wrote it down on paper and kept trying my hardest to figure out what was going on. I went up to a window facing my back garden. I breathed onto the window, and with my finger I wrote the digits 91GH 9M. I sat there looking at it for a while. I noticed that I'd left my jacket out in the yard, so I went outside to get it. When I picked my jacket up and looked back at the window where I had written the digits, it made sense now, and it was absolutely horrifying. It read, "Help me." Someone had written "Help me" from the other side of my neighbour's basement window, hoping that I would see it. Someone was in danger and needed my help. I ran and phoned the police. The police stormed the guy's house and found a 20-year-old woman handcuffed by her left hand to the wall in my neighbour's basement. She was naked and her hair had been pulled out and cut off. My neighbour had met her online, gone on a date with her, and then taken her home and locked her in his basement. He is in jail now, but I still cannot believe that I lived so close and for so long to such a sick, sick man. This story was written by a mother of two that lives in California. She describes her tale of a rather weird neighbour. I had been living happily for almost 15 years in my home. It was a nice and quiet area. Everyone on the street knew each other, and I was very happy for my kids to grow up there. Our neighbour that had been there since day one had decided to move to another state and rent their house out. This seemed fine, and we had not really thought much about it until we met the guy that moved in next door, the strange man that rented their property. He was literally one of the most creepiest guys we had ever met. He was in his late 40s, he dressed in all black, and he had the look of a man that had not washed for weeks on end. My children nicknamed him Scarecrow due to his lanky appearance, curly messy hair, and giant hands. I thought it was a bit of a cruel nickname personally, but my kids used to say his nickname around the house. Our neighbour, while being odd, mostly kept to himself. We had no real issue with him, to be honest, but sadly, that was all about to change. My children were 9 and 7 at the time, and they were off school for their summer holidays. I had purchased an inflatable swimming pool, and the kids would spend all day playing in the garden. One day, my 7-year-old daughter told me something that made me feel very sick inside. She said, "Mummy, Scarecrow watched us play today, and he told me not to tell you." I asked my daughter what had happened. She told me that our neighbour had been watching them play in the garden all day from his bedroom window, and had told them not to tell me about it. I was completely freaked out, and I didn't know what to do. The next day, while my kids were playing in the garden, I would regularly go and check to see if my neighbour was watching my kids. He had his blinds drawn, but I had the feeling he was watching anyway. I also noticed that one of his blinds was slightly down. I could literally feel him watching us from his bedroom. It was such a horrible feeling. Somebody watching you, with not much that you can do about it. After this, about a week went past. A friend of mine sent me a message on WhatsApp. I could feel my heart sink, and my face heat up as I read the message. The message read, "Hey, aren't these your kids?" with a link to a random website. I opened the link, and there on some website, there were photos and video clips of my children, of them playing in my backyard. The video clips had been taken from the direction of my neighbour's bedroom. He had not only been watching my children, he had been filming them and uploading it to a website. I told my husband what had happened when he came home from work. He is not usually the aggressive type, but this set him off immediately. He went straight over to our neighbour's house and banged on the door. I could clearly see that our neighbour was at home, but he never opened the door. When I checked the link later that night, the videos and images had been deleted. We phoned the police, but shockingly they told us that there was not much they could do unless there were graphic or indecent images. We knocked a few more times on our neighbour's door over the next few days. He never answered, and we never saw him again. He remained hidden for the next few weeks, and then one night he left the property without informing the owners. We were so happy he moved out. When I was a kid, we had this neighbour. He was a bit of a loser. He was no real harm to anyone. He had been fired from his job, and he had a terrible alcohol problem. He would come back from the supermarket with cases of cheap bottles of wine and crates of beer. We almost never saw him actually come home with any food. He didn't really ever leave his house, He was on welfare, and he would only ever go out to buy more supplies of alcohol. We started noticing rats coming into our garden, and even our house. There were so many of them. We would usually get the odd rat or two every so often, but this was insane. In one day we found almost 10 rats in our house and garden. We had no cat either, so the rats just went everywhere they pleased. We noticed that the rats appeared to be coming from our neighbour's house, almost like he was breeding them or something. It was all very strange for sure. The rats kept pouring over our side of the fence. It was actually becoming unbearable. My dad went over to our neighbour's house a few times and knocked on his door, but he never answered. We knew he was home, but he would never come to the door. We began phoning social services to try and get them to help. It took them almost a month, but finally they agreed to help. Social services came round, and after examining the situation, they confirmed that the rats were actually coming from next door. They went and knocked next door. Our neighbour did not answer. They later came back with the police, and they broke the door in. As they broke the door, they struggled to get inside. Once they did, they found out that all over his house, there was at least 3 foot high in wine bottles and trash. There were rats running everywhere and through the bottles. Our neighbour had not paid his water bill, and the water company had cut him off, so the rats came in freely through the toilet pipes. They found our neighbour drunk in his bedroom, surrounded by a pile of wine bottles and trash that was actually taller than his bed. They later moved him to another place. It was really awful living next door to him, and I was glad when he moved out, but I'm also sad that he'll now be somebody else's problem to deal with.